Thanks so much for joining. I'm Wade Crowfoot, our California Natural Resources Secretary. We're going to give just a couple more minutes. We've got a lot of participants coming into the discussion now, and we'll start in just a minute or two. All right, well, thanks for joining us. Again, I'm Wade Crowfoot, and I have the honor of leading our Natural Resources Agency. First and foremost, happy Earth Day. We are in the run-up to the 51st observation of Earth Day, and we're using this week as an opportunity to highlight some of our best and brightest, some of the ideas and the priorities that are driving us, and the entities within the agency that are really advancing our progress in these different areas. Today, we get to do a deep dive on our state conservancies with a good cross-section of our conservancy leadership. And I'm really excited to do that. Before we do, I just want to share with you the rest of the activities of Earth Week if you haven't had a chance to check out our menu of activities. And so, James, if you wouldn't mind moving into the next slide, that would be great. All right. So actually yesterday, I had a chance to interview the Cal EPA Secretary, Jared Blumenfeld, on his epic 2,600-mile hike on the PCT. Today, we're obviously talking with our state conservancy leaders about the role of state conservancies in our work across the state. Tomorrow, we're going to actually continue the conversation with state conservancies with a different set of leaders within our conservancy movement on what the future holds for environmental conservation in the state and the role of state conservancies. So really excited about that. On Thursday, which is officially Earth Day, we have a day of action, which we'll be promoting through our social media. And I'll also be in a really interesting conversation with some external leaders about the role of nature in all that we do, from combating climate change to preserving biodiversity to achieving more equitable access to our outdoors and nature. And then we'll conclude on Friday with a talk, including a talk with some really dynamic scientists we have within our Ocean Protection Council on the state of oceanic science and how we're utilizing science to protect the coast and ocean here in California. So really excited about this week. And if you would like more information about these or to register for the discussions, please just go on to resources.ca.gov. Next slide. I want to highlight a sort of an, not even an event, but a movement, we'll call it, that we're kicking off this week, which is asking for your snapshots, your photographs. You don't have to be an agency employee, just really anybody in California, with a focus on providing with us and with the world photos of what conservation looks like in your everyday life. One thing we're working to do at the agency is to strengthen connection across our agency and outside our agency. So we thought this would be a really fun way to promote conservation as it materializes in each of our lives in different ways. So please be on the lookout for that. And if you could, and if you're somebody who likes to take photographs with fancy cameras like the woman on this slide, or simply with your phone, it would be great for your to have your participation. So thanks so much. Next slide. So let's move into the discussion today. And we have with us today 4 leaders of our state conservancies that'll talk about different aspects of the work. As you may or may not know, California is lucky enough to have 10 official state conservancies that are part of our Natural Resources Agency that have been created, I believe, all of them by statute, by a change of law, that establishes them as key entities within the state to help state government achieve their goals. Next slide. Now, these conservancies cover various parts of the state, and as you can see, they're not contiguous with one another. So not all parts of California are represented by a conservancy. but conservancies have been developed in areas where policymakers, legislators have identified specific needs or opportunities for environmental conservation or access or progress on many different natural resource priorities. And so we see broadly that our Coastal Conservancy works to advance our coastal priorities across the state, our Sierra Nevada Conservancy over a large swath of the Sierra Nevada, Tahoe around the Tahoe Basin, our Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy in what is in effect the largest estuary in the Americas, the San Joaquin River Conservancy, our smallest conservancy in the state, small but mighty, as I say, with 3 employees. And then a set of key conservancies in Southern California, including Baldwin Hills, Rivers and Mountains, Santa Monica Mountains, Coachella Valley Mountains, and San Diego River. And as we'll talk about today, each of these conservancies works a little bit differently, but they're all bringing a lot of creativity and effort to bear to advance the state's priorities. Next slide. And it's really a broad range of priorities and initiatives that these conservancies are advancing. And this was a graphic, kind of a storyboard that our conservancies put together, I think in advance of this discussion, to identify all that they're working in. Coachella, for example, obviously focused on deserts. Many of our conservancies focus either exclusively or partially on our aquatic habitats, some on more of our natural areas like forests, others on working lands. Let me identify another one that's actually not called a conservancy, but it's absolutely critical to our work, and that's the Wildlife Conservation Board. And we'll hear more about that today. So I think technically that's a little different than a conservancy, but certainly within the same constellation of groups working creatively in ways that are a little bit different than our normal state departments or agencies to advance these goals. So next, I'd like to introduce who we have here to share with us the story of our conservancy movement today. We have David McNeil. Give a wave, David. David leads the Baldwin Hills Conservancy in Los Angeles area. John Donnelly leading our Wildlife Conservation Board. Jane Freeman, who is our leader in the Lake Tahoe Conservancy. And then Sam Schuckett, who is maybe one of the deans of our state conservancies, who is finishing his final year of service as leading our Coastal Conservancy. So we selected these folks because they really represent a broad cross-section of the different types of entities within this group of 10. And we're going to get into a discussion today about how conservancies are structured, how they operate, what they're focused on, and what they're actually able to achieve. So to start us out, we're going to give everybody an opportunity just to introduce themselves, share a little bit about themselves and their conservancy, starting with David.
David, yeah.
That took a little time to get my audio unmuted. Thank you very much, Wade. The Bolton Hills Conservancy, the smallest of all the conservancies, was created in 2001. It was done through legislation initiated by Kevin Murray and Senator Kevin Murray, and then approved by Governor Davis. Secretary Mary Nichols congratulated me as the first executive officer back in 2001. And I figured it would be a short-term opportunity. I apologize for the phone. I can't even mute it.
No worries.
Okay. Anyway, Secretary, she congratulated me, and I thought this might be a short-term opportunity to do the work of the state because it was a 5-year sunset date for the agency. Well, here we are 20 years later, and we're still here with a sunset date, but I pay that no mind, as my grandmother would say, and we move forward and continue our work. Our territory is 2 square miles of open space in one of the densely populated areas of Southwest LA County. It happens to be a large urban oil field on top of that. So we have a little construct layer that makes things a little more challenging, but it's doing the right thing in terms of transforming land. And we serve nearly 2 million people that live within a 5-mile radius. And we're Park Pool. Obviously, we have 3 acres per 1,000 people. It can be said that the BHC has always been kind of an equity-based agency, right? Making sure that we're delivering the state's priorities to the doorstep of the people. We have a staff of 4 people with 2 vacancies. It's been hard to hire during COVID, but I'd like to fill those vacancies. And I think just to add, it pointed out to me very early on that our mission is unique to all the Conservancy. Our friend Joe Edmiston, took me over and as the oracle of the time. He said, "You serve the needs and desires of the surrounding communities. That's unique. That doesn't appear in very many statutes." And since that chat, I've been reminded day to day and time to time that we do serve the people and that our agency is sustained by standing with our constituencies and meeting them where they are.
Thank you, David. Let's move several hundred miles to the north to the Lake Tahoe Basin and hear from Jane.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, the California Tahoe Conservancy was established a little bit earlier in 1984. And like the other conservancies that were established at that time, the Tahoe Conservancy was created to complement the regulatory structure that had been instituted in the 1970s. And so our initial focus really was to acquire, restore, and manage environmentally sensitive land at Lake Tahoe and to protect Lake Tahoe from development-caused pollution. Also to protect the natural environment and to preserve scenic beauty at Lake Tahoe, as well as recreational opportunities. Since 1984, our mission and focus has grown. Today, we manage over 4,700 parcels. 90% of those are small quarter-acre lots within residential communities. We restore wetlands and streams, implement forest health and hazardous fuels treatments, support sustainable development projects with our land, as well as our standing in the community. And we provide public access to the lake and the trails. As the only California state agency with a purview just in Lake Tahoe, we're uniquely positioned to help integrate state policies and mandates at the regional level and to work with our sister state agencies to strategically lead California's efforts to help protect Lake Tahoe. We also work closely with our federal, tribal, state, and local partners to implement projects throughout the California side of the basin and also coordinate with the state of Nevada on basin-wide priorities. Today, Lake Tahoe has about 24 million visitors a year, which is larger than any national park. And so the demands on Lake Tahoe and the Conservancy lands has grown quite a bit. And so we have to be innovative and creative in how we address all of those demands and make sure that there's still equitable access to the lake and to all of the resources in the basin. Our board is one of the smaller boards with 8 members that are made up from local jurisdictions as well as state agencies, legislative appointees, and we have 1 Forest Service member. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. A great overview. John, Wildlife Conservation Board, as I understand it, your geographical remit is the entire state, and so you're a little bit different than a standard conservancy. If you would, talk a little bit about the board.
Sure, thank you, Wade. And it's a really privilege and honor to be here to be able to talk with you as well as the public of California. And WCB was created in 1947 through the passage of the Wildlife Conservation Act of 1947. We were originally placed in the Department of Natural Resources. That's where our home was. But in the late 50s, we were transferred when the Department of Fish and Wildlife became a department. We were placed in the Department of Fish and Wildlife. WCB is an independent board, separate and independent board with the authority and funding to carry out a capital outlay program for fish and wildlife conservation, restoration, and public wildlife-oriented recreation. WCB will be celebrating its 75th year this coming year in 2022. And we're going to be planning a celebration for sometime in next year. Looking forward to that. The membership of the board, Jane said they're a small board. We were very small up until 2016. We had actually 3 voting members of the Wildlife Conservation Board. Today, with the passage of some legislation in 2016, the board size was enhanced by 4 public members. So now we're a 7-member voting board. the 4 public members, 2 of which are appointed by the governor, and then 1 of each are appointed by the Assembly and the Senate. Since the inception of the Wildlife Conservation Board in 1947, there was also a legislative advisory body that they don't vote on the board, but they advise the board on legislative and provide legislative oversight. And 3 of those positions are from the Senate and 3 from the Assembly side. The current makeup is right now the 2 directors of the Department of Finance and the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and then the president of the Fish and Game Commission, and then the 4 public members. WCB administers 15 different programs throughout the state and for the state. It acquires lands, property interests, restores wildlife habitat, enhances wildlife habitat, and provides a diversity of projects statewide. We also have worked in the Channel Islands, so we do have some history on the coast side. We do a lot of work with Sam and his group on the coast, and other conservancies around the state. Even though we have a small organization, which is 36 staff, we're small, we're efficient, we're effective to carry out the conservation needs of the state of California. The mission of the Wildlife Conservation Board is to protect, restore, and enhance California's spectacular natural resources for wildlife and for the public's use and enjoyment in partnership with conservation groups, government organizations, and the people of California.
Thanks, John. And you have an enviable opportunity to provide a sort of an ongoing source of funding, or you're funded every year to actually advance your mission. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Right. There's the annual funding that we get is through the Habitat Conservation Fund. Well, we receive a lot of bond funding. As folks know, that is one-time money as through the life of the bond. But the Habitat Conservation Fund, it was passed as part of the Mountain Lion Initiative for Prop 117 back in 1990. And Prop 117 provides $30 million of general fund money or another funding source annually to the Wildlife Conservation Board and 3 other funding partners. So of that, and it's a $30 million allocation. Of that, WCB receives $21 million, and it's split up into the acquisition of lands for wildlife or mountain lions, oak woodlands, and deer habitat, and then acquisition of threatened and endangered species habitat. So those are 2 programs within WCB that are specifically acquisition. Also under Prop 117, there's 3 other categories. The Inland Wetlands Conservation Program. So we can either acquire interests or restore wetlands through the Habitat Conservation funding. And then the last is riparian habitat. There were 2 programs in the 90s that were created because of the passage of Prop 117. And those are ongoing programs in WCB now, and that's a riparian habitat conservation program and the Inland Wetlands Conservation Program.
Got it.
Both of those have a joint venture that I can get into later that supports and actually prioritizes projects for which WCB carries forward.
Yeah, one of the things we'll talk about here today is just, how conservancies are funded and some of the challenges of finding ongoing funding. So the funding into the Wildlife Conservation Board is really critical to meet, our state goals, including the newly announced 30 by 30 to conserve 30% of the state by 2030. So really excited. And you've got some dynamite board members, including former State Senator Fran Pavley, who is, of course, one of the parents of so many of, strong environmental policy across the state.
Yeah.
So Sam, in a moment, I'm going to shift to you, but I'll premise the introduction, your introduction with saying, when I came into this role as secretary, I didn't fully know, what State Conservancy did, how many there were, just how effective they can be. And I think one of the reasons why we're holding these discussions this week is to really elevate the role of conservancies and help people understand exactly how conservancies exist and really how they're advancing the state's goals. So I really want to appreciate all the conservancy leaders who have sort of taken me under their wing in the last couple of years to really help educate me on what conservancies are doing across the state. And Sam, as I mentioned, you're at the end of your tenure at the Coastal Conservancy, which of course is kind of a storied tenure. So along with icons like Joe Edmondson, you're really sort of been a guiding light on the Conservancy's movement. So I'd ask you to talk a little bit about the Coastal Conservancy to put some context on it. But then we'd ask you to talk to 5-10 minutes on sort of the history and the evolution of conservancies across the state before we get into a more interactive discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So I am Sam Schuckett, Executive Officer of the State Coastal Conservancy, a position I've held happily for 20 years, 4 governors, 5 resources secretaries. When I started, there weren't as many conservancies as there are now. The Coastal Conservancy, you saw from the map, our jurisdiction is more or less the coastal counties of California and the Bay Area. We were created in 1976. We were the first conservancy to be created in California. And as far as I know, conservancies are actually unique to California. Other states don't have entities quite like us. And I've always described the Coastal Conservancy, and this is true of the other conservancies, as sort of a Swiss Army knife of agencies. If you read our statute, there are lots of different things that we can do, and what we are doing at any point in time has to do both with what we're funded to do, what the priorities of the administration are, and so on and so forth. And I have about 67 employees, some of whom are watching even as we speak. One of the interesting effects of the COVID pandemic is I'm going to have a lot more people working in their regions when this is over than we did when it began. So I want to give a little historical background because I'm the old guy about conservancies. It's useful, I think, to think about conservancies in the context of the different waves of conservation and environmentalism in the United States and in California. So the Wildlife Conservation Board is a product of what I would call first wave conservation. The original conservationists were hunters and fishermen. They drove the movement for the regulation of their activities through the Fish and Game Commission, and they also drove a lot of land conservation, and they paid for a lot of land conservation. And the UCB it's the oldest of us all, but as it's evolved, it has begun to look more and more like a conservancy as opposed to simply the land acquisition arm of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is how it was created. The conservancies, and especially the Coastal Conservancy, are very much a product of the second wave of environmental activism in the United States and in California in the 60s and 70s. And that was the time when people started referring to themselves as environmentalists as opposed to conservationists. We use the term interchangeably now, but once upon a time it meant different things. And if you think about the 60s and 70s, particularly in California, what was happening? Well, the state was being developed fast and hard, and it was pretty polluted. And remember, one of the biggest oil spills was in 1969, and the holiday that we celebrate, Earth Day, of course, was first celebrated in 1970. And in the Bay Area and along the coast of California, there were citizen movements that created strong land use regulation of those places. BCDC in the mid-1960s and the Coastal Commission via citizen initiative because the legislature refused to act in 1972. A few years after the commission did the changes, and the legislature and a lot of the citizens who created the Coastal Commission said you know, we have this strong regulatory body, but this is a capitalist society with strong property rights. You can't do everything with regulation. We need a non-regulatory entity to work in the coastal zone, to buy land, to trade development rights, to restore areas, to build access, right? The Coastal Commission can block people from covering over the coast, and they can even require that, but they don't actually build staircases down to the beach, for instance. And that's how the Coastal Conservancy was created in 1976, which was also a time when the land trust movement in the United States was burgeoning. There were beginning to be more and more and more land trusts, starting with national organizations like TPL and the Nature Conservancy, and then trickling down into local organizations, many of which all in the UCB world work with really closely. And of course, this time when we were created, it's also when most of the environmental statutes that we all live and work with today were created. I mean, there haven't been many new big environmental laws really since the beginning of the 1980s. In my time, in government, our cap and trade system and groundwater regulation are really the two big, statutes that you can say, yeah, that's like the Endangered Species Act, or that's as big as, the Clean Water Act. All of the rest of it came from this period of great ferment. Over time, both the jurisdiction and the toolkit that the Coastal Conservancy have expanded. We did these in the Bay Area in their totality. That was added. There were people in the Bay Area who wanted their own conservancy, and they were persuaded that they'd be better off becoming a program of the Coastal Conservancy. At one point during the Schwarzenegger administration, we had a senator who really wanted us to extend our jurisdiction into the Delta, and happily he was persuaded that instead they should have their own conservancy. The Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy and Tahoe were the first two conservancies created after the Coastal Conservancy. In every case, there were specific legislators who wanted them because there were specific people living in those communities who wanted these conservancies, and in a few cases, the Coastal Conservancy, in some cases, conservancies have expanded their programs or jurisdictions. We most recently added the Santa Ana River, watershed, but in other cases, new conservancies were created, like the Sierra Nevada Conservancy and San Joaquin River, and so on and so forth. What do we all have in common? We all have in common, first of all, that each conservancy, and this is where we're a little bit different from the Wildlife Conservation Board, we're all about particular geographies that have their own sort of cultural and legal and biogeographical, which is a big word, commonality, right? The thing that we have is behind me, on the screen. It's the coast, which has its own regulatory regime unique to California. Are regulatory, right? We only work with people who want to work with us and who want to do things that we want to do. We have no sticks. We only have carrots. Sometimes they're very large carrots, but they're still carrots. We generally have close and friendly relationships with all levels of local government. And if you've worked in the state for a while, you know that the relationship between the state of California and its local governments is not always, smooth sailing. But conservancies work very hard to governments within their areas and have good relationships. We all have boards that are representative more or less of different constituencies. The Wildlife Conservation Board now looks exactly like the Coastal Conservancy Board. We have an oversight group, they have an oversight group, we have 7, they have 7. The conservancies that have come after us have tended to have larger boards, often with more local people on them. And these, the constituencies, large and small, that created us all interest in what we do. And we all hear from them, all the time and in different ways. And then finally, we're pretty small parts of government. And, small is beautiful. Because we are small and because our hierarchies are relatively flat, we are also nimble and able to move pretty quickly. I like to tell new hires at the Coastal Conservancy, if there's something that you want to do, you have to convince your supervisor, and that's it, and we can do it. And that's also, we come in different sizes, but none of us really are large enough where the executive directors don't know the entire staff, and the hierarchy is relatively flat. Of course, you're wondering, well, what were the other stages of environmentalism? Well, the third stage, I think, was the environmental justice movement that really arose in the 1980s in the United States and gave rise to organizations, and that many, most of us, all of us have responded to in different ways. And I tend to think that with climate being sort of the overarching environmental concern now, that's probably a fourth wave. There's a whole new world of new environmental organizations that are different culturally, for instance, than their predecessors. And of course, there's one thing we all have in common in the Conservancy and Wildlife Conservation Board world. It's worrying about and acting to adapt and mitigate for climate change. So that's your 40 years of conservation history there in a nutshell.
Well, thanks so much. And speaking of adaptation and really staying relevant, I think in just a moment I want to talk about how the conservancies have evolved to address a huge priority for the governor and the legislature, and that is greater equity. But before we do that, I want to ask a question about sort of the uniqueness of conservancies. And as you pointed out, Sam, conservancies are a little different than every other entity in government. They typically can be more nimble and more creative, and at the same time don't get the ongoing funding that some of the other departments get. And I'll observe that sometimes that's created a tension because folks are just trying to figure out sort of what box do you fit in. And you have to exercise a fair amount of creativity, for example, in the discussion of bonds, that sometimes gets folks confused as to sort of who you're representing and what you're doing. So I wanted to ask you just a very direct question for any of you, which is, how do you navigate this? How do you navigate being part of a big sort of centrally controlled state government, working with people like my role, but then maintaining enough autonomy to go out there and do creative things, and really balancing, as David said, these really community-driven needs with relationships on the ground that might reflect a very different reality than Sacramento. Who wants to take on that big meaty question first? Unmute yourself. Yeah, John.
I'll go first. Yeah, I think from WCB's perspective, I think one advantage we have going for us as well as the Conservancy is that we're a non-regulatory agency. So, there's not that fear of permitting regulation of that. What we bring to the table is we have years of experience. We know what the needs of California's conservation and wildlife are, because it's what we've done forever. And I think people recognize that, they're comfortable in what we do and how we do things. And and we're relatively quick in the actions that we take. Oftentimes projects, particularly if they have a big CEQA or NEPA or some kind of environmental regulation process, that takes years to develop that stuff. Whereas the conservancies and WCB, we can come in and, we get the project done, you see results on the ground. And I think that's one thing for me in particular, and I think my staff generally, is that, we see a project from start to finish and it's quick. And there's, some folks in our environment, all they see is the hard part of things, the permitting or the environmental work. They don't see the finished product. And we see that. And I think that's what, brings our staff to a level of, they want to engage and they're able to engage, and they can see the end result and they can feel the end result.
Thanks, David.
I can echo what John's saying in terms of putting projects in the ground and giving people things they can touch and feel. That's been the thing you can point to when you ask, why should a conservancy receive the bond funding? Why should a conservancy be the territory be invested in? I look at all the things that we've done and how much appreciation and how many people it touches, and it's really saying, the Conservancy needs to have a voice, and our agencies had a voice in that process in terms of trying to get funds allocated for communities of color, but also have leadership in Sacramento that is going to speak up and say, these people haven't been heard. They're voting for all these bonds, and certainly there's benefits, for the state of California historically and legacy wise. But in terms of understanding why people are voting for these things, that's where we kind of meet the road and we walk that line of saying there's a need, there's resources, and it's available, and let's try and get some.
Yeah, great point. And I think there's a great, I'll call on Sam in just a moment, but there's a great example even in the last month, which is of how policymakers recognize conservancies actually being on the ground and getting it done. And this has to do with the wildfire resilience funding proposal that came through. And Sierra Nevada Conservancy, of course, has been doing a lot of upfront work on planning projects. And so they were identified as a conduit for a major amount of funding, which is great and demonstrates, on the ground being able to get money out the door quickly and results. And some Southern California lawmakers said, okay, we get that, but we want to make sure that there are projects that get on the ground in our backyard too. And they made the case for funding into appropriate conservancies in Southern California for these shovel-ready projects. So what was actually approved between the legislative leadership and the governor and early action funding just last week actually provides for significant funding into multiple conservancies because they're identified as entities that can get the money working on the ground very quickly. Sam.
Which is an excellent segue. I mean, one answer to your question, Wade, is that we have to be pretty zen about how we navigate all of the pressures and demands on us. And as I told a supplicant I was meeting with a few weeks ago who wants us to engage in a particular project, he said, would you be willing to do it? I said, hey, if you go out and get the money for us to do this, then we'll do it. And the state has a problem with fires, which has gotten worse because of climate change, and and the legislature has decided to give us some money to work on it, and we're going to work on it because that's what we're here for. And when we've all, I mean, it's a little bit less true if your geography is very constrained, but at least for those of us who have larger geographies, you have to be willing to be looking out for what's the next new thing and be willing to continue relevant.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the issue du jour. Today, as I understand, the verdict's coming down on one of the police officers who killed George Floyd. And 2020 was a year of reckoning when we looked at our institutions, many of that were built in this first wave of conservation or second wave of so-called environmentalism in the 1970s that really have a major blind spot as it relates to equity and environmental justice. And as I look at the background, Sam, of your screen, or Lake Tahoe, Jane, or the Mountain John, I think we all recognize that Californians can't access all of this stuff we're working to conserve equally. And there are a few entities within our agency, probably like Baldwin Hills, that have that focus on serving communities that are parks poor or that haven't benefited from that access. But most of our institutions haven't. So how are you and your teams actually taking institutions that were built before the recognition of inequity and the need to redress, racial discrimination, and really trying to adapt your organization to the modern mandate that we have before us?
I'll take a stab at it. The traditional mantra, or one of the traditional mantras in land conservation, has been, if we protect it, they will come, right? If we build it, they will come. And for us, this time in history has caused us to reflect that that's not entirely or exactly true, that it's not enough to provide for physical access. You also have to think about what prevents people from enjoying whatever the open space is that you've created. The Coastal Conservancy actually spent some non-bond money to do some polling, starting with focus groups in different parts of California, including the Central Valley, and then a poll that was large enough to be able to draw both regional comparisons, but also ethnic and racial, and just asking people, well, do you like to go to the beach? Sure. Would you like to go more? Yes. What keeps you from going there? And really hammered home for us, well, it's not about that last 100 feet from the road, right? It's also the transportation that gets you there, and what do you find when you're there, and who else is there when you're there, and those have proven to be great things to work on, but also harder things to work on than a lot of what we have traditionally.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Jane, John, or John, yeah.
Yeah, I guess from WCB's perspective, I think it's just the way it's how we've changed our focus, how we've changed our thinking that helps us to generate the kinds of projects that are needed in those kinds of communities. A few years ago, about 4 years ago, we convened a workshop in Southern California, which we had never done before. How do we expand access in Southern California to meet the needs and the wants and the desires of the people who are really going to use it in Southern California? It was really eye-opening for me. It helped us kind of focus our public access program. Just last year, we've allocated over $5 million just in public access programs, a significant amount of which went to Southern California for those kinds of projects. Another thing that helped us really bring this to the forefront is another board member. One of the public members also is Alina Bokde, and she's with LA County Department of Parks and Recreation. And so Alina really brings a lot of depth and experience in that arena that WCB had really never participated in before. So, we're really looking forward to advance this in WCB and, having the funding and the resources to do it. And I think we're going to make significant progress going forward.
That's great. And I'll say, from where I sit at Resources Agency, we're on a journey on this topic, and there's a lot of work ahead of us. And, we talk about, 3 steps: listen and learn, commit, and act. And I think we're doing all of these with a heavy emphasis on listening and learning where there are gaps that we need to fulfill. David, I'm interested in your perspective, given that at Baldwin Hills, you've been focused over the last 20 years on some of these issues, where honestly, some of our institutions are coming to this much more recently. And I'm just interested in your assessment around where state governments or conservancies are at on this, and any insight you have over the last couple decades.
I'm encouraged, by the work of Natural Resources Agency today. It's a new group of people with energy and insight, and the governor's really taken it to heart, with some of the executive orders in terms of equity and access. I can speak about it forever, and certainly the folks in Minneapolis are tied up wondering, and the nation's wondering, how things are going to go down. One of the things I wrote down here, I know all the agencies work with the Cs, California Conservation Corps, as well as local corps, and that's working with at-risk youth. And the point that the work that we do, we've benefited from the work of our sister agencies, 100% in terms of supporting us and propping us up and providing us some leadership. But when it comes down to dealing with people and more importantly, youth, that's where my passion really is, and that's where our agency is focused. So looking at the schools, working through LA Unified School District, West LA College, working with our nonprofit friends at LA Audubon Society and others. I worked with Greg Boyle, who's Homeboy Industries downtown, Father Greg, and he says nothing stops a bullet like a good job. When I look at the work that we're doing, we're creating opportunities and paths for people, and we're the portal. I mean, we speak to the Natural Resources Agency's priorities and why it matters. If you get on our doorstep by bus, by bicycle, by walking, you're going to learn a little bit about the biodiversity priorities and climate resiliency and all those important things. But more importantly, you're going to have a chance to be off of the streets, out of just loitering and hanging around and creating some sort of Mr. Media record that's turned into a warrant that gets you on the freeway and gets you shot. And so we're saving lives. Really, that's how I wake up every morning, saying if one kid, is exposed to something that they didn't have exposure to before, as opposed to the concrete jungle, and their record is clean and they become a teacher and educator, they'll touch other kids. And that's all it's all about right here, for where we sit. Alina Bodke is great. I've worked with her, in LA Neighborhood Land Trust. She knows the local game. Now she's at almost the top of LA County. And they're great partners. So I think finding that local partnership, reaching down into the local agencies, knowing what's going on the ground is the most important Natural Resources agency our sister agencies can do.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for elevating that, the importance of jobs and opportunities for young people. Big shout out to the California Conservation Corps, obviously within our agency, that is hiring and bringing young people through from across the state into conservation careers. I'll also just flag as a real opportunity for conservancies and the state, this equitable economic recovery. And I know the governor's really committed to understanding, okay, if we're going to use this, federal stimulus funding, as well as our own state funding, how can we actually employ young people, provide economic opportunity on all this stuff? So David, I think what you guys are emphasizing down in Baldwin Hills is right on the money, and I think is really well positioned as we see some increased resources. Jane.
Yeah, thanks. The conservancies all have such, as much as we have alike, we also have different issues and focus. And like Sam, while our focus has been public access, it's not enough anymore just to provide that. And so I think it's such a great issue, and we've really appreciated the Resources Agency getting involved, because with climate change, there's a reason why there's 24 million visitors coming up here. They're trying to get out of the hot valleys and to be at Lake Tahoe and have some respite up here. And the biggest challenge that we've been dealing with for decades in this basin is really how to get people in and get them to these places to access nature and enjoy it. And it's obviously something that we have to work with all of our basin partners and regional outside of the basin to really try to address it, because it's a hard issue to crack. So, I think some of the other ways, though, that we as a conservancy can help is, really working, as David said, with the communities around the basin, and using our land and our sustainable communities approach to really, make sure projects like bike trails within local communities and projects like that are helping to support a more safe and pedestrian and bike friendly neighborhoods. And so I think that's one piece area that we can actually really help, being more regionally and local focused.
Yeah. We won't have time to dig into it today, but I really want to recognize conservancies for growing partnerships with tribal communities and tribal governments. I think one thing we're working to do across the Newsom administration, certainly in our agency, is really build those partnerships, recognizing that we have so much to learn from tribal communities around natural resources stewardship, given their stewardship of California's environment since time immemorial. So there's a lot that's happening, and I just encourage those who work for a conservancy, or certainly you all as leaders, to continue to drive in really creative ways to find those partnerships with tribes. In our last portion of the discussion here, as we get to the bottom of the hour, I invite any of our participants here today, almost 150 who have joined us, to put any questions they'd have for our panelists in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. But I want to ask you guys what you'll hopefully appreciate as a question, and I call it my magic wand question. So in a pithy way, if each of you was given this magic wand, what would you ask for from our agency, state government, policymakers, or communities? What do you really want to see to be successful in the work of you and your teams? We'll start with you, David. Maybe whoever wants to go. That's a big question. No bad answer.
I don't know, for us, for WCB, I'll go. I think, if you look at our agendas, each agenda we post our funding status, and right now we're doing pretty well. But I think there's never enough money to do the kinds of work that we should be doing and need to be doing. And I think for us, it's that funding that would be necessary. I know we talked a little bit about the Habitat Conservation Fund right at the beginning, Wade, but $21 million or $30 million total, that does not go very far anymore. And oftentimes for the bond acts, while it's great to have the resources, it provides, the funding to plan, design, and those kinds of things. But then you really need the funding on the back end as well to really do the implementation of those big projects. And I think, just that security of money and funding to carry out the work that we all do, I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's fair.
Maintenance and operations, ongoing funding streams that allow us to keep America, California beautiful. We could put in projects all day long, but if the budgets for the counties or the cities or the states don't have enough money to maintain them, then it is for naught, and you watch it go to waste. I haven't experienced that, knock on wood, but that's one of the things. And then, certainly my dream would be have see a secretary for resources that is of color or female, or, just be able to see the elevation of the people through the process. Hopefully one of our agencies touched at one time or another that was inspired to do the work. Those are the two simple things, but ongoing maintenance and operations money, certainly we all want sustainable funding for our projects, but that's kind of one of those.
No, it's important to point out, though. That's real. Sam.
No, I agree with my colleagues. The operating and maintenance money is an issue. The lack of O&M money is an issue that cuts across all of us, and you know, we need to figure out a way to capture some of the economic value that people get from enjoying the outdoors, and from all of the new ways that there are to enjoy the outdoors. I mean, I'm constantly struck at all of the, you know, the technology keeps developing. And yesterday I was walking on the beach, and there were, you know, 6 people out there kiteboarding with pretty expensive looking gear, right? You know, but the only user group that still really pays a lot are hunters and fishermen. I think that's a real, you know, we can buy the land, but we need someone to operate it.
Yeah, and there's a couple questions coming through on that front. You know, Joe Edmondson's tuning in, and huge thanks to Joe. I mean, you've been a guiding light of this whole movement on conservation and equity, and he sort of asked the question I asked. But look, this ongoing programming is recognized as a huge, or the funding for ongoing operations and maintenance program, huge deal. It's one we're trying to take on in the agency. Just for people that don't know the ins and outs of state government, you know, we've got a tax revenue system that is heavy on a very spiky sort of revenue allocation, meaning when the stock market's good, we get a significant amount of capital gains tax. The challenge is if we start spending that on programs across the government, we enter into a situation which we did over a decade ago, where then we're in a boom and bust, and we're making major service cuts. And so, you know, the folks that protect our budget over time have been very cautious about those you know, general fund surpluses. And so it is challenging, though, for us in the resources agency, because most of the resources that we get are one-time in nature. It's that color of money. And so how do we operate and maintain those areas that we acquire is one thing. But then if we're trying to build equitable access, we know that ongoing funding is needed to reduce those barriers. It's not just a capital cost. So we have some ideas and are making progress, but certainly the silver bullet has not yet illuminated itself for us. Listen, we're to the bottom of the hour, and really appreciate you all joining us today. You know, my goal, and I think our goal with these discussions today and tomorrow, is to really highlight and elevate the role of state conservancies in our work. And as we've talked privately, you know, one commitment I have sitting in this position for however long I do is to really help and support your work, because I think your success is California's success. You've demonstrated in so many ways that you are getting improvements on the ground that impact lives, whether it's that kid that can, you know, get off the streets and protect themselves and have a new opportunity, or whether it's saving that really important habitat for an imperiled species, or just keeping California the incredible environmental place. Conservancies have played a central role in that. So hugely thankful to each of you and all of our conservancies. I want to simply highlight tomorrow's discussion, which is exciting, with a new set of up-and-coming leaders within our conservancies. And we're calling tomorrow's discussion State Conservancies Fast Forward. What does the future of environmental conservation and conservancies look like in California? So please join us tomorrow from 12:30 to 1:30 for that discussion. And thanks once again across our state for everything that everybody's doing.